everyone can please take their seats and finish up some conversations. Thank you all very, very much for being here. I'm going to go ahead and roll with our typical chamber lunch format, which is to start with announcements. We do have another special event lunch at the end of this week. That would be Friday. And Congressman Don Young will be addressing us, and that will be at Cape Fox Lodge Friday at noon. And then we also have our chamber after hours event with Allen Marine Tours. Leaving at 5 o'clock, we'll do a 2-hour chamber charter. I'm going to keep the chamber announcements short, however. And I'll just roll right in so that we have as much time as possible. Governor Dunleavy, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Mike is yours.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for being here. It looks like it's a packed house, so hopefully this is going to be an interesting topic. I'm looking forward to questions. So I'm going to go through a slide deck pretty quick. If you guys can see it, it's going to be important. And you should on your table have handouts. Yeah, that's it. And you can follow that way too. But I'll run through this pretty quickly. So just to give you an idea why we're doing what we're doing in the manner we're doing it, with the timing we're doing it. And then I'll do my best to answer any question. I've got a wingman here somewhere. John, are you somewhere? John's right there after he gets done eating. John's our, I keep thinking secretary because I'm thinking federal. He is our commissioner of transportation. And so he's going to be able to answer, for example, detailed questions on the ferry system. I didn't bring my Medicaid lady with me. I'll do my best to answer the questions on anything regarded to Medicaid as well. And then one of the other two major issues will be K-12 education and the university. But what I'm going to do is give you a history of spending in the state of Alaska, revenue in the state of Alaska. I came up in 1983, so I was here during the '86 crash, and we're here now in these difficult times. I am 100% convinced that there are solutions to every problem. I always say that. Everything, we sent people to the moon in the 60s. Okay, we do face transplants, heart transplants. Everything is solvable. It's to hear me back there, okay? So thanks for being here. So I'm going to ask you to go to the first slide and just fill it out, okay? This is for me. This is a very instructive chart. This slide here, because what it does is it charts the history of revenue and spending in the state of Alaska. And if you look at this, and this is going to lead to all of the reasons why we're doing what we're doing in the manner we're doing it. But if you take a look at this, what you'll see is whenever we came into new revenue or more revenue, we spent money. So I'm going to take us back to the 60s. I'm not going to tell you how young I was back then, but I was young in the 60s. In Alaska, we were a state 250,000, maybe 300,000, and our budgets back in the mid to late 60s, our budgets were about $175 million a year. Our budget today is $5.7 billion. So our budgets back there were about $175 million. It was a young state, wasn't a lot of spending. We didn't have a lot of revenue back then. And then in the late 60s, as we know, 68, Prudhoe Bay is discovered. 69, leases go up for sale. And in that lease sale, in that year, $900 million was realized in that lease sale. The revenue then went through the roof. So with that $900 million, this is interesting, we start to spend more. In some years, we doubled and tripled our budgets right after that lease. And the thing was, and this is important, the people of Alaska, legislators, start to become somewhat appalled at the rate of spend, because we didn't know how much oil was going to be in Prudhoe Bay. There were estimates of $9 billion. We've pumped about $17 billion, so we far exceeded those expectations. But nonetheless, they didn't know how much revenue was going to come out, how much oil was going to come out of the ground. So what happened was, after the lease sales went out and spending started to take off, the people of Alaska became concerned, and through their legislature, they began to pass constitutional amendments. So we'll bring up constitutional amendments again towards the end of this slide deck. But they started to look at constitutional amendments. One of the first ones they did was the permanent fund. They put the permanent fund in place because, again, they were afraid of the spending. They didn't know how long crude oil they would last, and they wanted money for future generations. And I have to give those people credit back then. They were forward-thinking, and they were they were selfless. They looked at future generations. So the constitutional amendment for the permanent fund passes, I think, in '77. They then wanted to hem themselves in on spending. So they passed the legislature passed this and sent it to the people, an appropriation limit to hem in spending. The people thought legislators were spending too much money, governors and legislators were spending too much money, so they wanted to hem that in. So in '81, and then it was reaffirmed in '86 through a vote, the people wanted an appropriation limit. The problem with that appropriation limit at that time was the incline of spend was so great, and the formulas embedded in that appropriation limit were so liberal, it's basically not effective. You'd have to spend $9.7 billion today in state monies to reach that ceiling. So we're going to be advocating, as I mentioned, we'll get into a little more detail, advocating that we revise that appropriation limit and send it out to the people. So anyway, so you can see what happens. I think in '81, oil was at 34 bucks a barrel. And imagine this for a young state. We're the only other big oil play that comes online. The other one is North Sea. So you have the North Slope and the North Sea that come online. These are mega fields. It's right on the heels of the oil embargoes, the Arab oil embargoes that we were experiencing down south. Gasoline's going through the roof. These guys come online. Money starts to pour into the state of Alaska. And 1981-82, oil's about 34 bucks a barrel. Production is ramping up. It's not going to reach peak production until 1989, 1990 at 2 million barrels per day. And then all of a sudden, we get our first oil shock in the sense that the price falls out, falls to the floor. We go from $32 a barrel to 1985, 86, $9 a barrel. We thought it was the end of the world. I'm not going to ask some of you young folks here to raise your hand if you were here in 1986, but you experienced it. I was in rural Alaska experiencing it. I was a teacher, and I remember our administrators coming into our classroom in a small remote village saying, this is serious. We don't know what's going to happen, and as a result, we're going to have to tighten our belts. We're going to have to reduce travel. We're going to have to consolidate classrooms. We're going to potentially lay off folks. We're going to have to do this, but we'll get through it. And if you remember, you heard stories about houses in Anchorage and in the Matsu, people throwing their keys at the banks or putting them in the mailboxes, and the banks themselves were failing. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know if this was ever going to come back. To put this in perspective, that recession lasted 2 years. The recession we've been in lately has lasted 4.5 years. This is the longest recession in the state's history. And it's going to be interesting as we talk about how could that be, because we've been pumping billions of dollars into the economy. We'll talk about that. So 86 comes, price drops. This is going to be a very important period of time in between, because what happened during that time is the Exxon Valdez, unfortunately, hits the rocks. But it's a shot in the arm to the economy in 1989. It's putting a lot of people to work. And our economy starts to stabilize. And our growth in our revenue and our growth in our budgets, our spend, is about 2.5% per year during this time. It's basically flat. Now, a lot of people might have forgotten about the 90s and the early 2000s, but the point being, we weren't spending a lot of money because we didn't have a lot of money. When we don't have a lot of money in Alaska, we don't spend it. When we have a lot of money in Alaska, this is the moral of the story, we end up spending it. So during this time, 2.5% spend, the economy slowly recovers and then starts to diversify over time. In other words, we're doing okay. We're not doing great in the sense that we're spending lots of money and building lots of projects all over the place, but we're doing good. 2006, our budget was 2.7 billion. Today it's 5.7 billion, 13 years later. How'd that happen? Well, it was during this time that the bumper sticker came out that said, please God, give us another Prudhoe Bay, and we promise not to, I won't finish the sentence, but you remember that bumper sticker. Well, in essence, we get a new Prudhoe Bay. Price of oil goes through the roof. I think it was 2009, July 5th, it hit about $155 a barrel. Unbelievable. When you think $8 a barrel, or $9 a barrel in the 80s, and we thought it would never come back. So we're at $150 some a barrel. goes down, 140 some, goes down, drops down to 50 some in about 6 months, but then goes back up to about $113, $114 a barrel. So what happens during that time? Here's our revenues, but our expenditures begin to follow our revenues. We didn't learn from the last episode. So this they call delta, and we'll look at it, we'll talk about this in some other slides. This delta here, we were to maintain our spend at 2.5%, and not spend, between 07 and 2014, we spent 15% a year. In other words, our budget's increased by 15% a year. There's no economy on the planet that keeps up with 15% a year. As our spending is increasing, our economy is not necessarily growing, it's actually stagnant at this time. China's economy grows at about 6% a year. They got one of the hottest economies, if not the hottest economy. But our spending is growing at 15% a year during this time, but our economy is not growing with that. So what we're doing is, we are living off the high oil prices, but we start to bank some revenues. Now all of a sudden, oil crashes again, goes down to $26 a barrel. What do? We start to reduce our budgets, mainly our capital budgets, not our operating budgets, mainly our capital spend. We used to spend $2 billion a year, $1.9 billion a year. We start to reduce and pull in terms of capital spend. The problem is this: when the price of oil hit about $26 a barrel, I think in February of 2015, we started to have to use our savings. We've used $14 billion out of the Constitutional Budget Reserve in the past 4 years to service this gap between our expenditures and our revenues. I want to put that $14 billion in perspective. Earlier I mentioned that this whole delta represents $29 billion. But even that $14 billion could have probably provided electricity for all Alaskans for eternity at an incredibly low rate. We could have paid off our pension obligations. We could have paid down our bond debt. There's a whole host of things we could have done with that money, but we decided to do other things with it. And now here's where we are today. We have what they refer to as a structural deficit, meaning our revenues and the price of oil and our production, the revenues that come from that, it's not enough to service our expenditures. I want to just bring your attention to the tail end of this little blue line, and if you look closely, you'll notice that it's pointing upwards. In other words, last year, the legislature added money to the budget when we didn't have the revenues to support it. So this year, we have about $2 billion left in our Constitutional Budget Reserve, down from about a high of $16 billion. $2 billion left, because we don't have the revenue to meet our expenditures. We have about $177 million in the statutory budget reserve. Both the CBR and the SBR will be done in 14 months if we don't arrest this incline of spend. This incline of spend continues at about 4.5% a year. Remember, during the 90s and the early 2000s, it was about 2.5% a year. If we can arrest the incline in spend through the constitutional amendments that we're advocating, the appropriation or savings and spending rule, we can keep it at about 2.5% a year. There is a chance we can get out of this thing, because in the next 5 years, the estimate is, we're going to get 200,000 to 300,000 barrels of new oil on the slope. And it's not just imaginary. They've explored, they have found, they are actually in the process of developing and actually producing oil as we speak. And the estimates are 200,000 to 300,000 barrels through what's happening in the National Petroleum Reserve, but also what's happening in other finds around Prudhoe. So through technologies and some incredible exploration firms, we have found more oil. But we still have to close this. And here is the difference between what Governor Walker tried and what we're trying. Governor Walker tried to close that gap by filling it with new revenues. Permanent fund, the PFD, and there's a difference. The earnings reserve of the permanent fund is available for the legislature to spend. What we've elected to do for decades is use a portion of that for a PFD, and the other portion we would just put back into the fund. The last couple of years, starting last year, we started to use part of the earnings and reduce the PFD at the same time, but that was one approach that the governor and the legislature last year agreed on. And then Governor Walker attempted to get additional revenues through taxes, 9 different taxes that failed the legislature. Our approach is to try and squeeze these lines, get our expenditures more in line with our revenues through reducing the budget dramatically. And there's no doubt that that approach is causing a great discussion in the state of Alaska. What is it that we want to pay for? How do we want to pay for it? When do we want to pay for it? And that's part of this discussion today. Next slide, please. This is just another graphic that gives you an idea what we went through. And what this hash line up top represents is the appropriation limit that's currently on the books. It was supposed to stop excess spending. But as I mentioned earlier, it was fatally flawed from the get-go because the incline of spend at which it was pegged at, and then the formulas were so generous, and as some said, you could drive a truck through it, that you'd have to spend $9.7 billion to reach that ceiling. So it's an ineffective amendment in our Constitution. We're proposing, and this line's a little too flat. There should be a bit of an incline to it. What we're proposing is a spending and savings rule that was similar to this, that is pegged at a lower incline of spend so that we hem ourselves in, especially on our operating budgets, at about 2.5% a year. If we had had this in place since 2006, the wealth that would have been represented by what we would not have spent is represented by these bars, and it's about $29 billion in wealth that we would not have spent. Now, what could we have done with that wealth, as we mentioned earlier with the $14 billion? Could have put it in the permanent fund, could have had free electricity for all Alaskans for eternity, could have had a railroad to Canada, could have had 14 acre-sized ports, pension obligations paid off, bonds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can't go back in time. We have $2 billion of that dollars left in our CBR. Next slide, please. These are just two models. On the right is a model on our current situation. In other words, currently we have $64 billion in our permanent fund. And then you've got, this represents the earnings reserve of the permanent fund, which is available for government spending. And that's where your PFD comes out of, but also government spending. We have about 16 billion in that, 17 billion in that, because the market did well here the past 10 years. And then our CBR is represented by this gray, and you can see the constitutional budget reserve is shrinking. It's down to about $2 billion. That's the current situation. That model over to the left merely represents the possibility that if we had put that money, that 29 billion, into the permanent fund, instead of 64 billion, we would have a twice as large permanent fund. It'd be about 120 some billion dollars. And that would have allowed us to take out of that permanent fund, I think the figure is $6,400 per person, and about $6.2 billion could have been taken out of that to pay for government. So in other words, if we had saved our money, and we didn't spend it all, and we put it in the permanent fund, it would be spinning off enough money to pay for the budgets we have today, probably going well into the future. Next slide, please. This is status quo budgeting, meaning if absolutely nothing changes, that if we keep spending the amount we're spending, that if we keep spending at the rate we're spending, and that nothing changes, what happens here over time is that the earnings reserve gets spent down in the permanent fund. Now, for those that have said the last 2 years, all you have to do is just take the PFD and everything will be fine. Under SB 26, the bill that was passed last year that allows us to take $3 billion out of the earnings reserve, that $3 billion is supposed to be split between government and the PFD. Doesn't matter how big or how small, but it's $3 billion. At the rate of spend, if you look very carefully, I don't want to block folks over here, but if you look very carefully, you'll see the first 4 bars have a little bit of purple on top of it. That represents the PFD. So at our rate of spend, if nothing changes, the PFD will be gone in 4 years, consumed by that 4.5%. So not only will the government side of that $3 billion of SB 26 be consumed, you'll have to consume the PFD that comes out of that SB 26. That'll be gone as well. So the enemy of the future of Alaska, just like the enemy of the past in terms of savings, is our incline of spend. And then what happens over time is we start to draw on the earnings reserve even more. Earnings reserve starts to disappear. Then we've got a tax. People have asked me many times, Dunleavy, just take the PFD. And I say, it's not really a solution when you're spending at 4.5% a year. It's just a matter of time, a few short years, and you run out of that under the SB 26 bill. Okay, just tax me. It's always an interesting request just for somebody to want to be taxed, but just tax me. To fill the $1.6 billion gap, for every man, woman, and child from the second they're born to the second they die, it's about $2,200 per person. For every working person, and if you estimate that on 300,000 people working, that's $5,300 per person. So if you're a working couple, that's almost $11,000 just to fill the $1.6 billion. And then immediately, if your spend rate continues at 4.5%, you have to chase that with additional taxation of 4.5% over time, until these other revenues hopefully get online here, which they should in the next 5 to 7 years. Your taxes will continue to increase to be able to service this rate of spend. That's a bit of a problem for some. Next slide. This is what happens. This is a model again. And models can be, yes, they can be manipulated, et cetera. But under what we're proposing, which is reductions, and keep in mind, folks, there's no easy answer out of this. Governor Walker tried it through revenues. No easy answer. We're looking at this through reductions. No easy answers. And we'll talk about what the end game could be here pretty soon with the legislature on the budget. But under this model, what happens is your earnings reserve actually grows. Your permanent fund dividend actually grows. And you got to get out here pretty far before there's any contemplation possibility under this model, this stagnant model that we proposed, out here pretty far before you'd have to look at additional revenues of some type. So it's a different approach with different results. The status quo approach is going to have the same result, and that is spending down our savings, and then we have to talk to people about taxes. Next slide. This is just kind of a quirky little graph. And what it shows that Alaska is ranked in 2016, it hasn't really changed. Our economy is dead last in the country. We have the highest unemployment rate in the country. I mean, you compare our employment rate with Hawaii's. Hawaii's at like 2%. Colorado's at like 2.93%. So ours has been persistently high because we've been in a recession the longest in the state's history as well. But what this shows you is, even when we were pumping in $14 additional billion in the past 4 years above and beyond our revenues, it didn't really change the economic scenario, the condition of our economy. It didn't really improve it like some people said it would by pumping more money into it. Next slide. Here we go. We're going to start talking about ferry system, K-12 education, university, and Medicaid. Ferry system, which is near and dear to a lot of folks in coastal Alaska. There's no doubt about it. We are seeing less ridership over the years, and John will be able to clarify this when he comes up here and we ask questions, but I think since the 90s, it's either 100 or 200,000 less riders on the system statewide since the 90s. However, the subsidies were increasing until we had to deal with the recent budget issues for less ridership. And the fare box collection, in other words, what you're paying for a ticket, also decreased at this time. So what's happening is, when you just look at the numbers and not the emotional part of it, but just the numbers, things are going in the wrong direction for this to be sustainable is the issue. That's why we're bringing this up for discussion. We'll talk more about this when we do the question and answer. Your ridership's going down. Your subsidies that we can no longer sustain at the rate we're doing it, we're going up. And fare box collection was not where it needs to be to help sustain this. And again, we'll talk about this in a minute. Next one, please. University of Alaska spending. We spend more than twice as much per student than anywhere else in the country. And yes, we're further north, and yes, things cost more here, but the spend should not quite be like that. You're looking at additional maybe 30% spend. We spend a lot more. The issue that's confronting the university, as all of our systems, is we just don't have the money with the $1.6 billion. And so what do? So they're having a conversation internally, as we all are on these systems. And I think they have 400 and some, I could be wrong, if you quote me on it, I'm wrong, I apologize, but I think it's 400 and some degree programs. We can't necessarily be all things to all people anymore under these fiscal scenarios that we're talking about. But I do believe the University of Alaska can be one of the best universities in the world, if not the best, in things like Arctic engineering, sciences, anything related to, I think, natural resources. I think we could be the best that there is. But the issue is, are we going to try and spread our resources in a watered down or diluted manner to try and be all things to all people, or do we start to consolidate and focus on some things that we can do better than anyone? Next slide, please. This is a chart on Medicaid growth, Medicaid expansion. One of the signature campaign goals that Governor Walker had, Governor Walker came into the office there in 2014, which is right here. One of the signature campaign promises he had was to expand Medicaid, right? And everybody wants to help people. Everybody wants to allow folks to have access to health care. There's no doubt about it. But again, the numbers and the incline on the numbers and eventually the spend, there's a real possibility that this too may not be sustainable. We're getting more and more adults. Here are your children, here are your elders, here are your seniors. We're getting more and more adults that are going on Medicaid expansion. Oftentimes, this is also indicative of an economy that's in bad shape. Because the idea is that many of these adults would more likely be working if there was a good economy that's growing. They would opt for work, obviously, than having to rely on the government to assist them with health care. But nonetheless, you can see that as this grows, even though we are getting a substantial portion of money right now from the federal government, that may not always be the case, and there's actually a ratchet down over time that we'll become more responsible for. So we want to make sure that if we're going to have a Medicaid approach and overall our healthcare approach, that it's sustainable and that we get outcomes. Next slide, please. This is a particularly painful slide for me, as it is for a lot of other folks. But there has been talk that no money has been put into education, or little money. I'm not sure how to word it because I don't want to get into a lawyer discussion on exactly how much money was put in. But as you can see by this part of the chart, money has been put into education fairly steady over the years. There was $20 million, I believe, or $30 million was put in last year, $20 million additional money we're looking at this year. So there's more money put in. The number of students in the state of Alaska has fallen over the past 20 years. We're talking system-wide. You have areas like the Mat-Su and out by Bethel and a couple other areas where it's still growing. But generally speaking, we have less students today than we did 20 years ago. The part that's painful for me, it should be for all of us, and this is just one snapshot, there's no doubt about it. This doesn't tell the full story. But these are the score, this is the rankings for what they call the NAEP test, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's a test given every other year to students across the country, grades 4 through 8. And what the U.S. Federal Department of Education tries to do is just compare states to see how they're doing. The NAEP scores came out in March of this past year, and this is the part that is troubling for me, and it should be for all of us. There were only 2 newspaper articles on those scores, in which Alaska ended up as a system. And I know people will say in Ketchikan, as they do in other areas of the state, that their schools are doing well. And there are a number of schools that are doing well. We have a number of high-performing schools and some pretty good school districts. But as a system, we're doing the worst in the country when it comes to, for example, reading in 4th grade. So we're not doing as well as Mississippi or Louisiana. Now, like the other systems I talked about, we're putting more money in. In some respects, except for Medicaid, the number of individuals partaking in those systems, whether it's the ferry system or the university system is losing students as well, and K-12 is losing students, our outcomes are not where any of us, no matter where we are on the funding side of things, I think we all agree that our outcomes, we're also going to have to look at our outcomes so that we can do better. Next slide. So we're going to talk about how the approach that we're advocating is different than what's happened in the legislature the last couple of years, and how what's happening in the legislature right now is different. When you go through the budgeting process in Alaska, it's like Groundhog Day. It's the same thing year after year. We budgets put out by the governor, and generally speaking, the legislature doesn't agree with it. And there's a fight, there's publicity, there's newspaper articles, there's yelling and shouting. And eventually we come to a conclusion, but nonetheless, it causes stability in everybody's lives. It causes stability for investors. What is Alaska going to do? Is Alaska going to be able to get a budget that is sustainable, meaning year after year there's some predictability? Or is Alaska going to go through Groundhog Day every single year, just do this fight every year? We're advocating that we get out of this trap of fighting over the same stuff every year. And we believe that through 3 constitutional amendments, we can get ourselves in a pretty good spot. The first amendment that we're advocating for, and again, this is why our approach is a little different than what the legislature is looking at. Legislature is looking at, we won't know until the end game, and we're working with the legislature on this, but basically producing a budget this year, but it doesn't produce a permanent fiscal plan. By doing a savings and spending rule and replacing the appropriation limit that's on the books now, if we can hem ourselves down and this is what this is supposed to do, to 2.5% spend per year, that line from the 90s and the 2000, we believe that when we come into new revenues through the savings rule of this constitutional amendment, we can take those savings and once again pay off our pensions, pay down our pensions, pay down our bond debt, put money in the permanent fund, but also have money for capital, ports, railroads, grow Alaska. At 4.5% per year, and no caps, no controls really on our spending, we'll never have predictability, sustainability, or durability in a fiscal plan. So that constitutional amendment, in my opinion, is absolutely crucial to hem ourselves in. Now people will say, well, Dunleavy, we send you down there. We elect you to do these things. You should do the right thing. We should, but we haven't. The history shows that we haven't. And just as importantly, we're only one of 24 states in the country that in our Constitution right now, we have a thing called the initiative process. And we can initiate laws, the people can. Divorced of the legislature, you can initiate laws, and you can repeal laws that you don't want. We're only one of 24 states that can do that. The other 26, the legislature can cram down the throats of the people of their states taxes or reductions or whatever. Without the people, the only recourse that people have are lawsuits and electing officials out. But the framers in our Constitution, when they put this Constitution together, wanted something different. They knew from time to time, because they studied the history of other states, that you might have an unresponsive legislature and or governor. So they want to give the people of Alaska an opportunity to check that government through the initiative and repeal process. So you may say, Dunleavy, have we ever used that? We have used that a lot. We almost repealed SB 21, the oil tax bill, in 2014. We had a cruise ship tax bill that was initiated by the people of Alaska. So the point I'm trying to make is this with the constitutional amendments. If we don't involve the people, you, on the front end of forming a permanent fiscal plan, with you telling us if you want us to spend less, we run the risk of you unraveling it on the back end if you don't like the fact that we tax you or that we take your permanent fund. In 1981, the income tax was repealed by the legislature only because the people of Alaska were on the verge of repealing it through an initiative. So that's a big difference than a lot of states. And that's why I think we need the people of Alaska on the front end instead of the back end. The next amendment is simple. If we're going to tax you, you want to concur. If we're going to reach into your pocket, in my opinion, and take your money to pay for our government, you should say yes to that. Because if you say no to that, that's a message from the people of Alaska collectively to the legislature that you want us to look at something different, whether it's reductions or some other restructure with the permanent fund. So it's a simple constitutional amendment. A lot of municipalities have something similar through the referendum process in municipalities. And then finally, the last constitutional amendment is if we're going to change the permanent fund, again, like taxes, ask the people of Alaska if this is what they want. If the people of Alaska, if we are able to get the legislature, in my opinion, to vote these in, and you get a chance to vote on them, and let's say you vote for them, then those are the guardrails that keep us in place so we don't end up doing what we've done the past 30 or 40 years, and that is every time we come into more money, we spend it, and we grow programs, and we have this boom and bust cycle with our revenue and expenditures. I believe that gives us certainty, stability, and more important, durability. Because there's no reason for you to backdoor us on the initiative process if you're on the front end making this fiscal plan. Next, please. Oh, there you go. Marianne, are you here somewhere?
Can I borrow that mic?
If you want to stay in touch with us and get updates regularly on the fiscal plan, just text PLAN to 888-111. That's the word PLAN to 888-111.
Okay, so I'm going to just sum up this section, then we're going to open it for questions. But what I'm doing is not, I know people believe this, but it's not the machinations of a madman. I'm not trying to destroy the state of Alaska. That's not my goal. But my goal is this. When I was a senator, I put forth a multi-year step-down approach as senator. I proposed that to my caucus in the Senate. They adopted that. In other words, when we had $8 billion in a CBR, and we could see that we had a structural deficit, which means it's probably not going to be closed without some drastic measure, I proposed to the Senate, I was on Senate Finance, a multi-year approach in which we would step down, giving systems a chance to adjust, and using our savings as part of that step down to get to a place where we need to be. Although the Senate accepted that, in the end, the legislature as a whole did not accept that, and what we did was just pass another budget in which we spent more money. So what I'm saying is this: for us to end this thing once and for all, where we have stability, durability, predictability, you're going to need constitutional amendments, and we would not get to this place where we can do that if I pretended to you, especially given our revenue picture, that we can keep doing the same thing we've been doing year after year and expecting different results. That the money would replenish itself somehow, some way, and that this would be the solution. And as I mentioned earlier, taxes could be a solution to close that gap, but taxes oftentimes have their own ramifications when you're taxing a working couple $10,000, especially if you're not closing that incline to spend, which the constitutional amendments do. Taking your PFD has an impact, for example, on a single mother with 3 children. This year, that would be $12,000 for them. There's people advocating that we take that entire thing off of them, which is going to drive some of those folks to more expensive government programs. So there's no easy answer. I'm looking for your ideas as well. I'm going to ask John to come up here and take a seat so that we can answer questions in a moment, our Commissioner for Transportation. But I'd be more than happy to answer any question you have. We're all in this together. We want a solution. And in the end, we will get a budget this year. I just hope we get those constitutional amendments so that you guys have an opportunity to vote to tell us where you want to go for the future of Alaska. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to go ahead and we are going to accept questions for the sake of the media. We're going to go ahead and repeat the questions up here so that anybody who's in the back who's asking a question can kind of be heard a little bit better. So I'm going to go ahead and open the floor to questions. Who's going to decide who gets to talk?
He's the boss.
All right, boss, feel free to call on whoever you'd like.
I'll just point to him if it's a fairy question.
Okay, Matt?
So, I understand the, slowing the bleeding in our state. I understand that. What I'd like to hear from this group is I want some really securing a lead in sports. One of the worst things you can do is secure a lead, hold on to it for dear life, and strangle it to death. The other thing is building on a lead. You build a lead and continue to build on that. I understand the cuts. So after those cuts, what is that hope? What is that growth that you believe in that's going to change everything? Whether it be an Alaskan lotto or something that allows maybe the marijuana guys to get into the banking systems in Alaska, creates opportunity for our schools. But I'd love to hear, instead of the doom and gloom of let's cut everything, to what do you see is going to be the greatest impact for our Alaskans? Instead of securing the lead, what are we going to do to grow that?
That's an excellent question. That is the question for Alaska's future. Thank you. Came back from a conference. I was at an investor conference in Houston, one of the largest in the world. It's called Sierra Week, and I'll get to my point real quick here. We wanted to go down there. I was the only governor that went, but there were people from all aspects of the oil and gas industry and investors, the highest levels, sheiks, ministers, you name it. They were all there. And we went down to ask that, get a similar question asked to the investors. What do you think about Alaska? What's the future for Alaska? They love everything about Alaska, our access to the Pacific Ocean, our location on the globe. The international airport at Anchorage is the 4th or 5th busiest in the world. Our resources that are hardly even tapped. The list went on and on and on and on. That conference is geared for oil and gas, but the purpose of that is, the oil and gas, the purpose is to produce electricity, cheap electricity. And they talked about 2 billion people in the world that don't have access to cheap electricity. Here we are in the state of Alaska, we're washing electricity, we're washing resources, but we still are energy challenged internally in homes. So the answer to your question is this. We're working right now to drive down the cost of energy for Alaskans. I know we've talked about that, but I am bound and determined, and as dogged as I am on the fiscals, I'm going to be as dogged to make sure that Alaska gets the cheapest possible electrical cost to individual Alaskans that we can possibly do. And we're working through some ideas right now. But by producing cheap electricity, you end up with a situation like the state of Washington, you end up like a situation like Iceland, where their electrical costs are, in Iceland, it's 4 cents a kilowatt hour. State of Washington, it's like 8 or 9 cents a kilowatt hour. That's what will bring industry to the state of Alaska. They said your location on the globe and your proximity to China and your proximity to really every industrialized place on the face of the earth in the northern hemisphere, 8 to 10 hours by plane, they said bodes so well. But it's the electrical cost, it's the energy cost, and it's the healthcare cost. But if we can get the electrical cost down, and that's my goal over the next 3 years, for all Alaskans, if we can do that, we'll bring industry here, we'll keep Alaskans here, and we'll reduce the cost for Alaskans so they can spend their money on other things. But you can potentially see processing plants come up here. You can see OSB plants to chip and produce all kinds of wood products up here. You can see data farms up here. I'm not trying to be silly, but in certain locales in Southeast, it'd be very good for data farms. It's just endless. So it's the economic aspect to get through this. And what the investors told me down there is, all of this stuff works well for Alaska, but we've got to make sure that your fiscal solution, whatever it is, we understand it, so that we can take investment that's been sitting on the sideline and invest it in this new state of Alaska. They see us as a new state, brand new, because we don't have a lot of infrastructure, we're gigantic, we're at the top of the world, et cetera. It's electrical costs, in my opinion, for the future of Alaska. Cheap energy will bring industry here, it'll bring jobs here. The problem with the oil industry is this, and it's not their fault. It's becoming more efficient, so there's less jobs needed. And some of those folks fly out of state. You want jobs here where we're creating we're doing more to our resources here to create jobs and keep people here. That's how you build an economy.
We're going to go in the back here. Saw you first.
I actually just have a quick question. So I flipped through the budget and I went through every section. What I was wondering was the pre-K grants were cut by 60%. And obviously the education college section was cut by 44.6%. And on your slide you had mentioned that, obviously the state of Alaska is behind. So in cutting the pre-K section by 60%, doesn't that be counterintuitive to what you mentioned about how that was incredibly difficult for you? How are we supposed to teach our youth to move forward in the state of Alaska educationally if we're not providing them the foundations they need in order to do that?
Okay, so I'm going to reiterate the question 1 second. Just that let me know if I'm understanding right, how cuts to the education system are going to affect or improve upon the fact that we are, as you mentioned, last in the state. Is that correct?
We're cutting the programs and then we're telling the parents, stay here, right? And we're not providing the education for the students. And then we're wondering why they're failing. We're not giving them resources that they need.
Okay, so there's a number of different ways to answer it. It is painful for me because this is my profession. But putting more money into it over the years did not necessarily give us the results. So we have not, the results right now, just looking at that one indicator, I know there's a whole host of other indicators that we look at as educators, but just at that one indicator in terms of grades 4 and 8, the areas that were assessed, we aren't necessarily getting the results through more money. And I'm not trying to get off topic, but it's a similar situation with some of our other systems. The more money we're putting in, we're not necessarily getting the results. So that's one of the reasons why this started out as a budget issue for us, but I really think it's an opportunity to rethink how we do things. Can we do things differently? Can we do things better to get better results? I think we can. Seattle has a homeless problem. They just put $1 billion, or they're putting upwards of $1 billion into homelessness. What Seattle's finding is they're getting more homeless people. In other words, that money, more money does not absolutely correlate to improved outcomes. It's how one approaches the system. And that's what I think we need to talk about. Is it just any pre-K? Or are they research-based programs that if they're implemented with fidelity will give you the absolute results we know they can be? That's a different discussion than just saying we fund pre-K. Do we demand K-3 reading? Just very quickly, when those test results came out in March, again, there were only 2 articles. And that was it. When our budget came out and there were reductions earmarked for education, there have been marches, there have been newspaper articles. There was a vigor that I have not seen. I'm just saying, more money, we've put more money in the system, and nobody talks about the outcomes. Nobody's having a conversation about the outcomes. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is this: more money is not going to necessarily give you the outcomes. The honest, genuine discussion on how we really look at how we do things will probably give us the outcomes that we need. Do I think that by cutting the budget gives you better outcomes? Just the opposite correlation? No, I don't think that at all. We're reducing the budget because of the $1.6 billion deficit. But do we also take advantage to really have a deep, honest discussion about what we're going to do differently to get the outcomes that we need for K-3 reading, for example? Algebraic outcomes by 9th grade, 8th grade, proficiency algebra. We're not having those discussions.
So I just have a quick counter question to what you said then. So does cutting the budget for those programs seem wise then? I mean, if I understand correctly, looking at your section of the budget, there were no cuts in your section as far as the executive office or staff. The teachers in Ketchikan are going to be taking an average of 70 staff. So we're going to be increasing the staff size, taking a cut in the pre-K budget, increasing the staff, increasing the students, and then expecting them to learn. So if I get that right, we're going to have larger class sizes, less teachers, and no funding. So I just wanted to make sure I understood that. And how are we going to have that conversation? Will we have a panel of parents? Will there be a symposium? Because there was no section in there that explained that budget cut and why we did it.
Okay, so again, for the media, we're just going to kind of repeat. Your counter question is about the increased class sizes, the reduction in teachers, the reduction in budget, and how you're addressing that.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a local control state, 54 school districts. The state funds, and the local school districts have the conversation as to what they're going to do with that funding. There are some school districts that will put more money into administration, for example. There are some school districts that will weight travel differently than other school districts. There are some school districts that will put money on full-service schools with nurses in there, potentially. It's to a large degree, and it's not a cop-out, it is a discussion at the local level. I was president of Matsu's Borough School District. We got ARA funds one year under Obama, Recovery Act, American Recovery Act funds. They were one-time funds. I had colleagues that were superintendents tell me they were going to hire staff. I said, why are you doing that? It's only one-year funds. Because if we can hire the staff, then we can go to the borough and tell the borough that we have to cut people now because there's no money. We used our money to pay down obligations and do a retirement program for folks that were interested in retiring so we could reduce our overhead. So the point I'm trying to make is those discussions can happen internally as well as with the state. We're going to be putting out, it should have been done at the end of this week, maybe next week, an education omnibus bill that talks about how we can do things differently. We're working with legislators on that. We're getting input from people in various parts of the state on that. So that's going to be our approach, to have a deeper discussion on the outcomes and how we could look at things differently in the face of less finances. But the local school districts, on average, as a system, we put 54% of our dollars in instruction in the classroom. We put 46 in other areas. So that, I think there needs to be a discussion at the local level and the state level, and that's what we're proposing.
I'm going to bring the mic over to you to make it a little easier since you're close.
Hi, I'm Joey Tilson. Hey, so when you're talking about all these cuts and such, and our population being so small, it's 772,000 in the state of Alaska, roughly? When you cut these and people start shopping around for other locations of where they're going to live, where their child is going to get a decent education, where they're going to be able to get food and shelter and whatnot and cheaper, and then they leave, and then you have this great economy because the population is smaller to service. I guess what I don't understand is why are you not investing in the people? And there seems to be a great number of spending that we're not aware of that is happening, and we're not seeing the results with the people. Like you say, that we keep putting money in and we're not getting good results. Well, a lot of these people that are being invested, like our seniors, I'm caseworker for the state of Alaska, and I've seen the people that come into my office, that come in there and they have nothing, and their social security is nothing, and they depend on that $250, and you take that from them. I don't understand the concept of cutting and not investing in the people and then saying that we're overspending, when I can tell you our elders are not overspending. I can tell you our kids are not overspending. And when you're cutting the ferry system to our outlying communities that don't have the capabilities that the bigger towns have, and they depend on that ferry, and we all depend on these jobs, and to tell us that all you want to do is cut and there's no other revenue. When I see $26 a barrel going to the oil industries when the average is 12 to 13 down south, I don't understand why the SB 21 went into effect. I didn't vote for it. And then you say we're overspending. I don't see anybody in this room overspending. What I do see is that we are not investing in the people that live here, and they're going to leave. And when you talk with Americans for Prosperity, or you talk with these agencies that want to piece apart our economy, when they don't live here, they don't interact with our communities. I just want to know why there's not additional revenue sources that you're looking at. I want to know why we're not investing in the people here so that they leave. Thank you.
Oh, you're not going to repeat that question?
Nope.
Oh, that was a punt. I'm going to do my best to answer your question. So they have been leaving. Previous to this budget, they're leaving. They've been leaving for the past 3 or 4 years. When we were funding an additional $14 billion over 4 years, they are leaving. We do have the worst economy in the country. That's a fact. I'm going to give you facts. So the fact is they are leaving. They've been leaving previous to my administration, leaving. The economy is in recession. It's the longest in history, going on 4.5 years. The unemployment rate is the highest in the nation. So I want to invest in people. But the way to invest in people is we have to get a handle on this spend of 4.5% a year, because we no longer have the traditional revenues to pay for it. I've had elders talk to me and seniors talk to me. Some of them are grateful that they will be getting a $3,000 PFD under my scenario. Well, they are. They say it's 3,000 or
3,000 divided by 12 is what? Roughly 300 bucks, right? That they're going to get, and they still need that additional $250 a month. you take that $250 a month, they're still only getting $300.
But I'm just trying to answer the
Yeah,
question.
I'm trying to understand.
Right, trying to answer the question. And so I want to invest in people in the state of Alaska, but we have a government right now that exceeds its ability to take care of itself through the traditional revenues. So if we go, I mean, and there are people proposing this, take the PFD. Again, I have to think through what happens with that single mother that's working and that's making $40,000 a year. She's got 3 kids, it's an extra $12,000 a year, but take that PFD off of her. Chances are that may drive her to other government programs which cost more. I am thinking of her. I am thinking of the state of, I'm thinking of our kids as well that need to have a future in the state of Alaska by having an economy that's growing. We have kids that go to school here and they leave. They go to the lower 48 where there's better jobs, there's more opportunity. So what's preventing us is getting a handle on this budget and making it a permanent fix instead of a lurch from year to year to year to argue over these things. So no, I want to invest in the state of Alaska. I want to invest in people. I don't think spending at the same rate we've been spending is going to be in the mid and long term for the best interest of the people of Alaska. And we have to have a discussion if taking, and it's an average of 300,000 workers, $5,000 per person is also in the best interest of those people when you have an economy that's in recession. And we've already shed thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs from the private sector over the past 4 years. If that will push more people to leave. As I started this out, it's not an easy answer. We will get a budget. I'm willing to look at a step-down approach, and I've talked to the legislature about that. But we simply don't have the revenues to continue to spend. And to replace that $1.6 billion, it's going to be a tremendous tax on some, if not all. And if we take the PFD, the same thing will happen. So it's difficult, but I do care about people, and I do want Alaska to do better, and I want Alaskans to stay here, and I want the state to grow.
Well, just one thing is, I'm a single mom with 2 kids, and I did not seek out any programs. I work hard, and I didn't get assistance. So that kind of story isn't a typical, all single moms do that. I'm just saying that I had 2 kids, not 3, but I live on an average $40,000-$50,000 a year, and I didn't seek out those, so that's something to think about.
Okay, thank you.
I'm gonna go. We'll get to you next. I'm sorry. Nope. Kim, go ahead. For the media.
Governor, thanks for coming to town. Good to see you.
Good to be here.
I'll be quick as I can. The budget, I've heard many memes made up about it, from an echo chamber that says it's the greatest thing since the second coming, and down to it's a napalm scorched earth. No one is happy. The one thing that I have noticed through many articles in all of the keyboard commandos, all the blogs, is the division that has just jumped up in the state, from coastal to inland versus, from union to non-union versus this, from the haves and the have-nots, those who can afford not to have a PFD to those who truly depend on a PFD for the winter. It's really divided the state somewhat in an ugly way. I agree. You know, I campaigned for you. I was behind you. I understand that cuts have to be made. Everyone does. What I don't understand is the picking of winners and losers in this budgetary process. I would prefer, as my plan in simple numbers, why can it not be 20% across the budget for everybody? And that 20% across the budget also means the oil companies pony up their 20%. It's easy to pick low-hanging fruit in the way of taxes and what can be done simply. But quite honestly, Governor, 20% across the board, everybody pays the same. Not 75% out of AMHS, not 60% out of K through 12, and 0 out of Mother DOT. I mean, 20% everybody. We are Alaskans. We need to be pulled together as Alaskans. This budget conversation has divided Alaska in a very ugly way, in my opinion. So we take 20% across the board, but then the oil companies, everybody, it's called our fair share. I'll borrow it from the Democrats. Pay our fair share. So the oil companies, they don't get a further cut in their taxes. They get to add 20% in. That 20% additional tax oil revenues could easily take care of your PFD problem that you want to pay, and the 20% cut across the board could go a long way to starting to stabilize to where you want to be. But it's fair and it's equitable to all Alaskans like you speak about, instead of picking the winners and losers. One final comment. Your OMB manager, that poor lady has taken a lot of hits. I don't blame her. She was tasked with a job to do, and she did it really well. She showed you what the numbers were. This is what we're spending, and this is what we're bringing in. Everyone who runs a household understands you got to make those match. But you can't do it in a scorched earth way. And for Alaskans, because we are Alaskans, it needs to be across the board and equitable to everyone. One final note, in the division that I've noticed in all of it, a lot of people inland and up, not on the coast, think that, well, you choose to live in those places that need ferries. Figure it out yourself, pay for it yourself. First thought that comes to me is, well, you choose to live in an earthquake zone. So when the earth shakes and breaks, you pay for it yourself. Don't come to the rest of us. It's all about parity and equity. Thank you.
I appreciate that. I mean, I do. It's all the feedback is good feedback. It's certainly not my intention to divide the state. I understand what you're saying. And, you know, sometimes you have to wear a hazmat outfit to go on social media. It can be a pretty ugly a place to be for certain times. But we have to start a conversation. It was not intended to be divisive, but it was intended to be introspective. Can we afford what we're doing? Can we continue to do that, or can we do it differently? And that's where I hope this conversation leads. That's the goal. Can we do it differently? And how do we pay for it? And so I know there's folks that are discussing various aspects of oil taxes. That discussion's coming up. And I don't want to deflect from what you're saying, because what you're saying, I appreciate that. I've internalized. No, because it was spoken well. If we don't get a permanent fix, and I don't want to harp on the constitutional amendments that Hem has sent, but it's really the people of Alaska saying, we don't want you to spend as much money anymore, and we want to be involved in the revenue discussions. If we don't do that, we're going to be going through this divisive issue time after time, because in order to get to the revenues, you got to have the people part of that, because if they're not part of that, they'll backdoor us on the initiative process is what's going to happen. You bring up the oil taxes, which is a legitimate discussion. It certainly is. The people voted on that initiative, and they didn't want it to happen at that time. Who knows? It may be different now, given the budget scenario. But I guess where I'm going is, I just want you to know, and I think you know, it's not my intent to divide the state. I don't want to be a governor that was known as dividing the state or destroying the state. But I'm willing to take on a very difficult conversation so we can get to resolution quicker, because we don't have the savings cushion we once did to get to where we need to go. And as I mentioned, I'm more than happy, and I've talked to the legislature about looking at this over more than 1 year, but we got to have guarantees that we agree to that all of a sudden they come back next year and say, you know, oil hit $70 a barrel. We can get through this one more year, because it's just going to continue the pain. So I appreciate that.
Just to follow up, but what about parity across the board? Why the winners and losers? Why not, if the state's going to be in it, you cut straight across the board, 20% on every line item instead of the winners and losers?
That's a legitimate way to look at a budget. Also, what we did is we looked at our largest expenditures, those areas, to look at reductions. We believe, for example, in Medicaid, we're working with the federal government. We believe that we can get flexibility with block grants and a block grant approach that can actually lower the cost, but also maintain a sustainable health care program for some of these folks. So there's nothing wrong with what you said. We approached it a different manner. That's a discussion that I think is legitimate as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, I told you I would go with you next, so go ahead. I'm just going to repeat your question back. So.
Okay. I heard you say multiple times up there talking about our resources and how the rest of the world loves our resources and how attractive we are to the rest of the world and other states and comparing us to them. We're more than just our resources. We're people. We have families. We want our children to go to good schools. We want ferries to come to our communities. Imagine if you didn't have a ferry taking you from the airport to here today. Imagine where you would be right now if the plane stopped flying. Ferries are very important to us. We have so many amazing people in this state, and great things are happening in this state. And the budget that you proposed, I don't see it dividing us. I see it bringing all of us together. This budget hurts every single person in the state. Every region has their own gifts and strengths, and they have their own challenges. This budget cuts every single region, every single person in this state. And it's really important to know that I think we are together on this, that we're all being hurt. One hurt, it's not more hurt for someone else than it is over here. Everybody hurts equally. The ferries, losing the ferries here hurts us. Up north, if those folks up there lose the taxes that they charge for the property there, they're losing their money for their schools and everything else. This budget hurts everybody. And as Alaskans, we are standing together and we're letting you know. And I really wish that you'd have more town meetings in bigger venues so you could really get a piece of what we're all thinking, or what the majority of us are thinking. Now, I'm a teacher, and I have a really hard time believing you standing up there, what you're saying is hurting. I have a really hard time because you're not a single mom with 3 kids. You're not in the schools. You're not helping kids with special needs every day. You're not seeing what those kids are accomplishing every day. We may be last in the nation in our education. I don't see that in my classroom. I see what I'm given every single day and what my colleagues are doing and what we're accomplishing in this state. So I take some offense too. I'd like to see some of your documentation on what you have up there. What I'm getting at is, I have seen a budget where you have been talking about the permanent fund as if we should be in fear of losing it. We are going to lose it because oil is going to go away. That's the reality. We are not going to have our permanent fund for very much longer. That oil is going to be gone. I would really like to see a budget where you have all of those cuts and you have the oil tax credits and you cut them. And I would like to see you balance the budget with those oil tax credits. I'd like to see a budget where you're not just cutting and taking from these services that make us the great state and the great people that we are, because you're going to take that away. You said we can't be everything for everyone. We can't be nothing either. We have families that we want to be here and we want to support, and with this budget, you're driving us where our unemployment rate you say is high now. You wait until this is done, what's going to happen?
Is there a question?
My question is, let's see a budget where we see the oil tax credits get some kind of a cut and see how that balances our budget. That is my question. Can you propose a budget? Will you propose a budget that shows oil tax credits and having them get cuts like 40% for education? Let's see that and what that looks like and how it will fund our state. Will you make a budget that shows oil tax being cut?
So the question for the media is, will you show a budget with oil tax credits being cut?
So capital credits have been already eliminated over the past 2 years in oil. And the legislature has an opportunity right now. When you roll on a budget on December 15th and then you revise it on February 23rd, that's a starting point for a discussion. If the legislature wants to look at things like oil taxes or other type of taxes, they're looking at the permanent fund, for example, that's how the process is supposed to work. We're supposed to go through that process where they have that discussion. We proposed what our version was of the budget because the past 4 years, Governor Walker's attempt was at various taxes. They were rejected. So we came in with a reduction approach to have a different conversation. But there's nothing preventing the legislature from having a discussion on any type of revenue matters. Nothing at all. And you've got representatives, you've got senators, but there's nothing stopping them from doing that. And so if they want to have that discussion, we can have that discussion. We've talked about just about every tax, and I'm being honest with you, over the past couple of years. We've talked about almost every type of permanent fund modification. And just a clarification, it's simple. The permanent fund itself won't go away because of oil, because it's invested on the market. It's a whole different ballgame. It's protected by the Constitution. But any revenue measures, people can raise those and have those discussions.
I want you to have that discussion.
I'm not going to right now. I'm just
I
being.
want you as the governor to have that discussion.
Oh, I'm just telling you, this is the approach of the budget right now for discussion. The legislature can add revenue discussions if they want, and then that becomes part of the discussion.
And the governor cannot add those discussions?
No, I'm saying I'm not going to. This was our approach to the budget at this point. This is the discussion that we've initiated. If the legislature, which the budget is not going to look exactly like we proposed, if they want to talk about revenue measures, including oil taxes, they can do that. That's part of the process, is what I'm saying. We're one piece of the process. They're part of the process in the House and the Senate as well.
Okay, we're at 1:25 and we were slated to kind of end towards 1. How many more questions would you like to take?
I could be here all afternoon. Well, I don't know about that. I think I have I don't know where my people are. Okay.
Okay, we'll go until 2?
Yep.
All right, I'm going to ask, I know that we all have some really, really important things to say. However, if you can be a little bit more concise in your questions so that we can hear from as many people as possible. I'm going to go, Representative Ortiz. I saw your hand.
No, that's fun. Thank you, Governor Dunleavy, for coming to Ketchikan and to hear from the people of Ketchikan. I really appreciate it. And I know, as well as you, it's not always an easy thing to do, so I really appreciate your presence.
Speak louder.
Thank you very much. One of the things in the discussion that we've had so far, one of the things that I don't feel you addressed fairly is the fact that we have been going through several years of budget reductions. You talk about the discussion's been about revenue, but Governor, you know as well as I know, we've also gone through some significant cost reductions. I mean, some definite budget reductions. Specifically, the Alaska Marine Highway is down $25 million in UGF from where it was in 2015, which we all know in this room has resulted in already significant reductions in service. So there's that. With that said, I think when you talk about your plan doesn't call for any added revenue or any added taxes, I think that's disingenuous as well, because what your budget calls for is cost shifting down to the local level in the form of, for example, our local city and borough will have $800,000 less in revenue due to reduced fish taxes. We also will see your proposal includes an ending of school bond debt reimbursement. And with the end of school bond debt reimbursement, that cost, those bonds are going to be paid by the local community. So there again, you're forcing the costs down to the local level. So in the end, local government, they can't just not pay the bonds. So they're going to have an increase in taxes in order to pay for those bonds. So it's disingenuous to say that your proposals aren't calling for any added revenue. What they're calling for is cost shifting down to the local level, and you're forcing the local municipalities to look for added revenue. So with that, what do you think?
Okay, I'm going to try and address this as best I can. Representative Ortiz was asking how looking at cost shifting down to the local level is going to be addressed. Try and get back up to you here. Sorry guys, I should have planned for 2 microphones.
So thank you. So can my folks go to that slide that has the Marine Highway System real quick? Is that possible? I can't see it right now. I have on the slide, Representative, I just want to be clear, I'm not being disingenuous about reductions. I mentioned that we have had reductions, and that's why that's on the slide. That demonstrates the fact that we've had reductions. What I'm saying is we still have a structural deficit, is what I'm saying. At the same time, well, can I answer the question? At the same time, people are saying that there's been no increases in education. That's somewhat disingenuous as well, because there have been increases in education. I have that slide up there as well. With regard to cost shifting, absolutely that's a discussion that needs to happen at the local level. It's happening in my own borough where I pay taxes as well. How are we going to deal with these reductions if these reductions actually materialize? What I'm saying is at the state level, there's been no proposals on my part to put forth taxes. We just had that discussion. So I'm not saying there has not been reductions. We actually detail that on our slides. I'm saying we have a structural deficit that needs to be closed. And with regard to taxes, no, we're not proposing taxes at the state level, but will the local municipalities have to ponder additional taxes? Yes, they will.
Okay, I'm going to come right back here to you. And Governor, I did get a note from one of your staff members in the back that we only have about 10, 12 minutes left, so.
Governor, thank you for coming, and appreciate you taking the time to talk about the budget and other things. One of the positive things I heard you mention was talking about trying to bring economic growth to Alaska, and one of the tools you're going to use to do that was low-cost electricity. But I really haven't heard anything other than that soundbite. So I was wondering, what tools are you going to use to actually bring low-cost electricity to the state as a whole? Because there's an issue trying to bring it to the interior, bringing it to Southeast Alaska, low-cost electricity statewide. So can you describe a little bit about how you might do that?
So one of the first things that we'll do is, and it's a statewide issue. You've got isolated communities. You guys have hydro down here. You've had a bit of a drought, which is causing problems with the diesel. I understand that. But for example, just talking about the rail belt for a moment, we are still working through the possibilities of a gas line that could bring gas for export. We're still working with folks on that to see if, in fact, that is something that can happen. If so, then that particular line would bring gas down to places like Fairbanks where you could generate electricity. We're also looking into a direct current possibility coming from the slope where electricity is generated on the slope and then shipped down through a wire to the rail belt as well. We want to have, and I haven't started this yet, and it's a good point, how do we ensure that your situations, for example, on the coast that have hydro, how can we ensure that their capacity continues so that they don't have to switch over to diesel, for example, when there's a year or two of less water? We want to have the discussions as to whether shipping up from BC or the lower 48, LNG, compressed gas, propane, whatever, which could also augment some of the hydro up and down the coast is another possibility.
Tidal power. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Okay, well, there you go. There's tidal power. And then potential biomass with all of your timber here in Southeast is also another possibility. So we just got in, I'm just saying, on December 4th. We're wrestling with this. I'm not making excuses, but all of these discussions are happening internally. We just need to engage, for example, the coast and rural Alaska on how we drive down the cost with potential DC power going west as well on the slope to hit some of those communities as well. So I'm not going to sit here and say I've got all the answers right this second, but I do know that we have some real possibilities that I want to put into realities to reduce the cost of electricity throughout the state of Alaska, regardless of how diverse it is, through a whole host of means.
Here's a very question.
Second mic is on its way.
Hi, Governor. My question has more specifically to do with Medicaid. I represent a large number of Medicaid recipients. Home and community-based programs have received some pretty significant cuts in the last couple of years to the tune of roughly $25 million. That's already been a significant impact to people with developmental disabilities, physical disabilities, and the elderly. These people are terrified now with the proposed cuts to Medicaid as it is. I know a couple proposals have been presented regarding actually separating the senior and disability services budget from the remainder of Medicaid. Considering the cuts and the losses that have already been experienced, I can acknowledge that most of Medicaid funding goes to pay salaries and jobs and for people to be employed in the industry. And so with unemployment being such a major issue and funding being such a major issue, we're talking about taking away more funding that's going to result in more job losses and less services to people who are vulnerable and in need. People with developmental disabilities and the aging don't get to decide what happens to them. The state is very in charge of what happens to their life. And so you have a lot of control over people and how their life is lived. And so I'm very curious how cautious are you going to be about those impacts and how it's going to actually directly impact people's lives without forcing more institutionalization, more pioneer homes, or causing people to leave their communities?
Well, we're cutting pineapple. Remember that.
Again, I apologize for not having our Health and Social Services Commissioner here. I'm not an expert in health and social services, but I do know that they are working diligently internally and working with the federal government on ways to block grant, but also get more flexibility in the money that they have to try and address some of the issues that you've raised. We're gonna do the best we can. I'm just saying, given the situation that we're in, to try to minimize the impacts on Alaskans. We don't want to maximize detrimental impacts on Alaskans, especially some of the most vulnerable, as you mentioned. So I'm going to strongly suggest, it's not an excuse, it's not a wave off, but for Commissioner Crum to come down here and have a discussion with folks, at least get down here hopefully within the next couple weeks and have that discussion. I know he's had discussions with folks in other parts of the state, but to be able to answer your questions in details that I don't want to take on at this stage of the game, because I might give you the wrong answer, but I do know that they are excited about the possibilities of being able to get some flexibility to continue to extend care to folks that you've mentioned.
But wouldn't you agree that the most vulnerable Alaskans should not be paying the price of a financial issue with the state?
Yes, sir. Yes.
It's not their obligation to pay for a mistake by the state. Why would they lose services because of a financial mistake on the state?
No argument. You're getting off here. You know.
Welcome to Ketchikan, Mr. Gavin. I hope you come more often so we can have the conversation going. Out of curiosity, how much is still the cost in the state of Alaska? Because I've been overseas a few months ago, and the comment was that we in America, we spend over 70% more than any other country in this world as we know it. And the students, they know much less than the other ones. According to what I was told, we are 71% below any other nation. However, please don't be offended and don't feel bad about it, because the administration before yours and the one after yours will be in the same position. We losing money, doesn't matter how much we pay and what we pay. My property tax, they go up every year, and then my house gets old every year. And then this roof and such. However, on this ferry system, I would like to make a comment, please don't be offended. Would the people up in north, the interior Alaska, would be happy if your administration, or your lawyers or whatever, give you suggestions, they would stop the service this coming winter after the interior Alaska don't have a snow removal and maintenance and emergency? How would they feel about that? Because here, unfortunately, we are Alaska Airline or the Alaska State Ferry. So if the Alaska Airline decide, because they're a private business, they say, hey, we are not going to fly to Ketchikan for the winter. And the ferry ones won't be in the winter. How do we get out here, Mr. Governor? I know it's not your fault. All right, thank you so much. And
You're going to, you going to render the question down for us? What's the question?
The question being, if the ferry system was cut, and if anything ever were to happen to Alaska Airlines or any of that were to be reduced, what would Ketchikan do? What would a community like us do?
You want to take that one, John? We're gonna get he's going to give me a little break here on this one.
Yeah, I felt left out for quite a while on this one. I haven't taken it personally.
Do you know anything about Medicaid that you might be able to answer, folks?
I could give just as wrong an answer as you could on Medicaid, Governor. As far as the marine highway system goes, we recognize, the governor recognizes the value of the system to coastal Alaska, not just Ketchikan, not just Juneau or Sitka, and not just the runs from Bellingham, but there is a tremendous value to it, as well as for transportation, as well as the role that it plays in commerce. The transportation of goods to and from Alaska, getting fisheries product out of here. You know, Alaska Airlines doesn't fly every day. And their program has improved since they developed the GPS approaches. They don't have as many missed approaches. And I think part of Alaska Airlines' success is impacting the marine highway system, because air travel is a lot more reliable now than it was 20 years ago, when you ended up sitting for days because they couldn't get in or couldn't get out. And that's had an impact on it. I don't think you're going to see the system go away. I think there's a recognized personal need for the transportation, an economic need for the transportation, and it certainly plays an important role in Ketchikan since the headquarters are here. You've got the shipyard, which there's 2 beautiful brand new ships there that are going to be, one of them is going to be going into service in less than a month, and the other one next summer, hopefully. The system will survive, but the model is going to be different than the model that we've been living off of for the last 20 or 30 years. And when the system was originally developed in the early 60s, and I had a conversation recently with Governor Egan, at the time, Governor Egan's head of the highway department, who wrote the model for the system. And that system was, we build road lengths wherever we can build roads, and we build shuttle ferries to connect those road lengths. And every time we've had an opportunity to follow that plan, and that wasn't the only time that plan has been developed. It was developed again in the late 70s, again in the late 90s. But every time there was an opportunity to implement that plan, we went back to doing the same old thing. No, let's build another ship to fill that route instead of building a road. Well, you've got a couple of ferry models here out of Ketchikan that work very well, and those models need to be followed in the rest of the system. The IFA, the Prince of Wales, that goes to Prince of Wales Island, that thing gets 85% of its fare box recovery. That's pretty phenomenal, considering that the rest of the entire system gets about 35%, and it provides an excellent service. Still requires public support. Public support is also called a subsidy, but in that system we call it public support. And then you've got the Lituya that comes twice a day from Metlakatla. That's a great operation right there. The ship is home ported in Metlakatla, and believe it or not, that ship operation breaks even. And it breaks even because they built a road length from Metlakatla to the end of the island so that it was a short shuttle run. So what we've got to do in this system is start following the plans that have been, the initial plan and the plan that's been validated about a half a dozen times since then, and we build road segments and shorter ferry runs to operate the system. And that is a sustainable system.
Can I ask a question?
You can.
Because I'm here to learn, so I want to ask a question. And this is for Representative Ortiz. This is not a political gotcha. Is he still here?
I'm here.
Oh, okay. I just can't see you. I'm sorry, Representative. Are you going to propose a tax? And if so, what would it be? And are you in support of any of the constitutional amendments to allow the people to vote on this permanent fiscal plan?
I'm in support of your amendments.
I couldn't hear. I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm in support of giving people a voice.
Thank you.
in what happens with both revenue and with budget issues for sure. Your other question was about?
Are you contemplating? There was a question about me proposing a tax. Are you going to propose a tax for the people of Alaska?
I don't see the House majority proposing a tax this particular year based on the indication that you would veto that.
No, but would you introduce a tax? No, will you introduce a tax? You introduce it. I was asked if I was.
Me personally?
Yes.
No, I'm not, because I'm part of the House majority. However, I will tell you that we heard with our roadshow, lots and lots of folks began to call for an income tax based on the understanding that there's a quality of life, there's an element of living throughout Alaska which people want to preserve as we move forward through these admittedly difficult budgetary times. So we've been hearing more and more. I'm sure you probably have heard the suggestion on occasion as well, that people are coming to the realization that added revenue may be a part of the solution as we move forward into the future. But to answer your specific question, will I be introducing a tax this year? No, because it's been determined that 2 years ago we did, as the House majority, we offered a tax, passed it through the House, on the House side, and it got rejected by the Senate. I think the governor would have signed that bill, but we did pass a totally balanced budget partially based on the tax as a part of that as well. So we don't see the point of doing it this year because, again, you've stated clearly that you would veto such a thing. So no, we won't.
Thanks on the constitutional amendments.
Okay, folks, that is all that we have time for in the way of questions. Governor, was there anything else that you'd like to wrap up with?
Yeah, just 30 seconds.
Yeah, go ahead.
So thank you for having me. Thank you for being here. Thanks for packing the house. We're going to come up with a budget. There's no doubt about it. That's how the process works. None of us, myself, Representative Ortiz, anyone, wants to hurt Alaska. We're in a bit of a pickle. We've got to come up with ways to solve this. I'm interested in a multi-year approach. I'm glad that Representative Ortiz is supporting the right for the people to vote on what this permanent fiscal plan will look like. But I came up here in '83, and Alaskans are tough folks that when they're in a tough situation, we pull together. So I intend on working with all aspects of the legislature to come up with a budget that's going to work for Alaskans. But I want to thank you. Yes, I'll be back. And no, I don't get my feelings hurt that easily because I'm trying to listen to folks to come up with solutions. It's a diverse state. You guys have some great ideas. You're pretty passionate about things, but I want to thank you all for being here and offering your suggestions. So thank you very much.